So firstly, thank you very much for inviting me to join you this evening. It's very kind of you. I've had rather a busy day. I've just driven back from Oxford because I'm doing some work out there. So it's nice to get back to London and back to my own home. And it's also these drives, which I'm now doing rather frequently between London and Oxford, usually listening to the news as I go along, give me a little bit of time for reflection. And I thought that what I wanted to do this evening, seeing that you were very kindly said that the topic was really entirely what I wanted, was perhaps just to do a short reflection on the current state of our country, just to think a little bit outside the box, a bit beyond the strange activities taking place in at the Conservative Party conference. Because I think there's some questions we need to ask of ourselves if we are to find a way out of some of the current challenges that we're facing. So if you'll forgive me, I'm going to start by going back a fortnight to the death of Her Majesty the Queen. Because one of the curious features when such an event happens is that we go through a period where, and we do this quite often in this country, some people think it's just pageantry, but it isn't, of acting out our constitution. And it's a very peculiarly British thing to do. So as you'll have seen, Queen died. There was an announcement of her death. And then the following day, in a strange and actually late medieval ceremony, well, it was 2 days later, it was the day after, at St. James's Palace, the new king was proclaimed. An extraordinary assembly which brought together members of the Privy Council and one or two others, not all members of the Privy Council, sadly, I wasn't included, something I rather regret. I've been telling my wife for years, the one benefit I would have of being a Privy Councillor was that I would attend the Proclamation Council, and we ended up being axed because there were too many of us. But it's rather an important ceremony, because in it, all these grandees, great and the good politicians, all turn up along with judges, senior civil servants, army officers and the like, and say, the Queen is dead, long live the King, because that's what the law of the land as set out in the Act of Succession of 1702 says. And that's it. And then after that, of course, King is proclaimed. I went, as I'm the honorary recorder of the Royal Borough of Kingston-on-Thames, I went and attended that in my full legal fig, which was quite entertaining in itself, and nobody chucked rotten eggs at us, so it was all right. And then, of course, we had the state funeral, and we had thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who turned up both to pay their respects at the lying-in state and then for the funeral itself. And of course, at the funeral, I think this also has met a bypass people. The crown and the scepter and the orb, all the symbols of earthly power were placed on the coffin. And then at the end of the matter, when the coffin was in St. George's Chapel, they were ceremonially taken off and handed to a rather strange group of people, including the Queen's barge master, to be handed to cleric to put on the altar because they were no longer needed, because she was dead and she was equal with all other Christians for her burial. And of course, those symbols of earthly power sat on that altar eventually to be used again sometime next year for the coronation of King Charles. And although some people may find this all a bit curious and all a bit quaint, it actually sent out a very powerful message about the nature of the British state. Quite apart from anything else, one of the curious features of it was that the Prime Minister was really pretty peripheral. She had a short lesson to read in the course of the funeral. She went round the country respectfully. She's, after all, the principal servant of the sovereign. She had been sworn in and kissed her hand at the ceremony in Balmoral Castle 2 days before the Queen had died. And she had her first audience with the King. And actually, for 2 weeks, it was almost as if ordinary parliamentary government with prime ministers had completely disappeared, and some people may have breathed a sigh of relief. Perhaps that explains why so many people turned out on the street. But the message was pretty clear, and actually it's reinforced in a number of other ways in our constitution. State opening of parliament, when the Queen comes, or the King now, will come along to open parliament and read the speech from the throne. That very strange ceremony at the end of the passage of a bill through Parliament, where the various people who have been involved with it in the House of Lords as party leaders, including those who've opposed the legislation, all don fancy dress with funny hats and doff their hats to approve the passage of the legislation on behalf of the King, as it now is, thereby also impliedly assenting to it themselves because they have participated in the process, so that although they may not have liked the legislation, they have accepted the legislation is being enacted and they accept that it's now the law of the land. And as I say, we do this all the time for ourselves, acting out our constitution. Now, why do we do it? Obviously, it's historic, but we cling on to it, I think, in part because as a country, we've always striven in the last 150, 200 years, despite political polemic, to have what is called quiet government. Now, quiet government is what I go and pray for at church on a Sunday. Actually, the words are that we may be godly and quiet governed. But even if you don't want to bring God into it, most of us are actually quite keen to have quiet government. And when I started out my political career, I was in absolutely no doubt that one of the things that we were supposed to try to deliver to the British public as politicians was quiet government. Not to say that politicians aren't going to make mistakes, not to say that politicians aren't going to sometimes find very challenging issues on which they're going to disagree. The desire is a quiet government, a place where people can get on with their lives, and a place, obviously, where government is delivered of a kind that enhances our well-being, so we can live under the Queen's peace. Quite important, so you don't get mugged in the street outside, so your national defence is protected, and nowadays also so that you can have access, however poor you may be, to decent standards of healthcare and social care, obviously within the limits of what a country can afford. But nevertheless, these are the things that politicians should be striving to achieve. Mind you, we often disagree on how best to do it. But just compare that for a moment with what has been delivered to us over the last 6 years. The last thing you can say about the period since 2016 is that we have enjoyed any form of quiet governance. I can't think of a week going by without some new crisis, some new hysterical moment, some new moment where government has been polemically attacking its opponents in vitriolic terms and getting the same back. And a succession of prime ministers, most of whom seem to have been struggling to maintain any sort of order or discipline of any kind at all within our governance system, culminating, one might argue, in the strange events of the last 10 days, where we get a new prime minister who gets into office in very difficult circumstances, I might add, is undoubtedly, well, I'd like to think she's an improvement on her predecessor, who was actually a scoundrel. But finds within 10 days that, in fact, she's engaging in the most extraordinary rhetoric about wanting to shortcut our way to national prosperity in manner which endangers our international credibility to such an extent that the pound collapses. And of course, the pound has been doing quite a lot of collapsing over the last 6 years. It actually started, although we didn't pay much attention to it, at 48 hours after Brexit. And it's been doing it periodically ever since. And there's no real sign that there's going to be a pickup, any more than there's a real sign that our economy, which is vital to delivering those quiet governance goals I was talking about earlier, is in fact going to recover markedly. In fact, the projections for next year are pretty dire. 0.5% growth, which is why she has embarked on this extraordinary policy, flying in the face of most economists assessments of trying to obtain 2% more growth than has been projected, which would take us well ahead of our competitors and partners, despite the fact that at the moment, the projections for their growth are significantly higher. So, for example, even in the coming recession, France's growth next year is projected at 1%, whereas ours is projected at 0.5. Rather telling figures, particularly when you compare them to the UK's economic performance in the years immediately before Brexit took place. So the problem we have, it seems to me, is that we do not have quiet government. And actually, we have government that is now struggling in that dreadful combination of stagflation, which I remember all too well, because I am 66. I do know what the 1970s and 60s were like. And there is the most serious risk that we are just going to repeat exactly the same performance all over again. And I hesitate to say this because many of you have probably made up your mind a long time ago the way you're going to vote at the next election. And I suspect for very good reasons it's not Conservative. And indeed, I'd rather doubt myself that I'm going to be voting Conservative the way things are going. But whichever party ends up in office, and it applies to Labour as much as to Conservatives, unless there can be a sensible dialogue with the electorate about the steps that are going to be needed to put the UK back on a sensible course, then we are going to continue to see more of what we have just been witnessing. Because the problem is, at least in part, to see a problem of government. And I hope if Keir Starmer becomes Prime Minister, his approach will be completely different. But the problem is about the hysterical attempts at trying to shortcut your way out of the problems you are encountering, because you will not accept the underlying problems might perhaps require a fundamental rethink of the way the United Kingdom is functioning and going. And obviously, the principal issue on that is the old B word. I don't think Brexit is readily reversible, but the question as to our economic links with our closest partners is going to have to be reconsidered, because the damage we've done to our national economy comes directly from the interruption of our participation in a single market. And even if we can't go back into the single market, there are some things that we can do to make trade better, quite apart from the fact that we would also solve the Northern Ireland Protocol. And I say that against the background where we've just discovered from Liz Truss that she finally has accepted that we're not going to do a free trade agreement with the United States. There's talk of a free trade agreement with India, but I have to say I'm very mystified as to what exactly it's thought that is going to deliver in terms of major economic growth. So there needs to be some realism. And the second area of realism we need, because we're living in a really dangerous world, as anybody watching the news tonight will see in relation to the Ukraine, is that we are at serious risk of armed conflict. And actually, although we are doing the right thing in the Ukraine, I have no complaint about that, I am left with a very distinct sense that we are not able any longer to exercise the diplomatic leverage we had, particularly with either the United States or our European partners, to try to influence the outcome that we want. I find it rather ironic that we sit on the sidelines complaining that countries like France aren't doing enough, and yet we have removed ourselves from the meetings of foreign ministers of the EU quite deliberately, even when they said they would continue to have us even after we'd gone, because apparently that is an interference with our own glorious sovereignty. So as this autumn deepens, and I fear the crisis that we're facing deepens, I think politicians of all parties need to do some thinking. What is it that we are trying to deliver for the citizens of this country? How do we best advantage them? How do we give them that leg up towards prospering, achieving their ideals during the course of their lives, and looking after those who are most vulnerable and manifestly will not be able to achieve those goals. How do we do that? And how do we do it in a society where we need to bring people together? And the willingness of people to be brought together was obvious during that period of 10 days national mourning. There's a yearning for it. Indeed, you could almost say that the Queen's death provided the excuse for people to go out in the streets and make that very clear. Who's going to harness it? Conservatives? Well, difficult to say that's going to happen at the moment. Certainly not with the present Prime Minister. Keir Starmer, possibly. Other political parties probably don't have a say in it at the moment. And we have to face the fact that we're also living in an era at the moment where people are so cynical about politics and politicians that you're left constantly with this impression that they just have given up on politicians. And that is a bad thing because it means they resort to direct action or direct process or to influence political process because they don't think there's any point in participating at all. And we've seen that with the young. So there's a whole series of challenges. Now, I remain, I should say, the end of my little peroration and before we move on to the Q&A, resolutely optimistic about the future. I happen to think that the United Kingdom has lots of advantages from its geographical location, in temperate climate, to its population and to its institutions that go to make a good future for my own sons and I hope eventually grandchildren. But my goodness, we've messed it up in the last 6 years. And we're going to have to start thinking of some sensible solutions to get ourselves out of the hole we have dug. And that is going to require leadership. And I just hope it comes from somewhere. So thank you very much. I think that concludes my opening comments for this evening. And now we can have a conversation. Thank you.